Welcome to session 365, Natasha Helfer's experience with excommunication, question and answer. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There is more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. After the symposium, Sunstone staff will edit, polish, and re-upload all of this year's session videos to the Whova app. It will take about 2 weeks for everything to be available, but once it is, every video will be available to watch and re-watch in the Whova app through the end of 2021. Please type any questions into the Whova app to be addressed during the Q&A, or if you're watching in person, we'll open the audience mic for questions. Obviously not just at the end, since the whole thing is question and answer today. So Natasha welcomes a Q&A format with the public about her recent experience going through a disciplinary council and getting excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Brigham Young University and her master's degree in marriage and family therapy from Friends University. She also received her certifications as a sex therapist and sex therapist supervisor from the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. Natasha is a speaker, writer, and podcaster with 23 years of clinical experience, primarily working with a Mormon clientele around the issues of relational health, faith transitions and journeys, and sexuality. She writes a blog called The Mormon Therapist and hosts the podcast Mormon Mental Health and Mormon Sex Info. Natasha has authored 2 books, One Family, Two Views, Mixed Faith Marriage, and Check Your Baggage on challenging sex-negative messages. Helfer was recently excommunicated from the Mormon Church for issues surrounding her advocacy for sexual health.
Hello, everybody. Trying to talk to 2 microphones here, so hopefully everybody can hear me. Thanks so much for coming, and I just have a few thoughts before I'm going to open it up really to the audience, which is what I want today mostly to be about. So when I made my first announcement, which really was a plea to receive support letters for the disciplinary council that I was about to experience in April, and they had said that I could ask for support letters, I really didn't expect the response I received. And I'm still trying to make sense of all the thoughts and messages and letters that I was able to, have the privilege of having in my email box coming in. And it was very humbling. And I realized pretty quickly that this was so much more than something that was happening to me, but that was happening to many of us, or us, as I would like to say. Because so many of us were represented in what was happening to me. I think I had in my mind all the people who share my profession and all my colleagues and the many hours and hours of discussion and debate that I've had with many LDS Mormon therapists and non-Mormon therapists who work within our communities. I had in mind all of you who seek out our services. I had in mind all of you who are seeking information and have so many questions either about yourselves, your spouses, or your children in regards to the very complex and diverse ways we do show up in the realm of human sexuality, which has been present since day one in my practice. And I had in mind all of you who are or have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, asexual, or queer children, and are needing affirming spaces that also include your spiritual and religious journeys. So it became something much bigger than me in all of those weeks, and I had all of you very much in mind as I was going through the different experiences that I went through, and as I was trying to communicate with all of you publicly about what was happening. So the only disclosures I have for today is that I am a crier and I'm emotional. I think you've seen a lot of that already. And I don't apologize for that ever. think emotion comes along in lots of different ways, and for me, it often shows up in my throat and in my tears, and that's okay. You can ask me anything you want. I don't really care what you want to ask me. I may not answer everything, either because I don't know, or it will be considered more private. So don't take offense to that, or it's just whatever, it's kind of my discretion about what I'll be willing to answer. And as we have this discussion, I'm just encouraging all of us to think about our own relationship with our Mormonism, because I'm sure that there are things about my story that resonated with you and things that didn't. And there are things that maybe you would have done really similarly to me or done very differently. And I'm not going to apologize for my way to Mormon and how this went down for me. So I will kind of end with that. I've asked a few people here who were there in Kansas with me to just kind of be here with me in case they knew answers that maybe I don't even know. So I just like Clint and Jenny, if you can stand up and just say hello. So Clint and Jenny Martin came as supporters of what I was going through, and they were at the grounds, the church grounds, and probably have a lot more information about what happened there than I do, because I was only there for a short while. And there's Jana Spangler and Jennifer White, if you both want to stand. And they were both people who had traveled and were willing to be witnesses on my behalf, and were turned away from that opportunity once I had my little kerfuffle with whomever I was having it with, because I don't even know their names. So anyway, so if you have questions for them, I would like to give them an opportunity to speak as well. And then I noticed that, is Mike Hansen here? Did I see him earlier? Maybe not. Well, Jody Hansen is here as well, but she has something going on with her. She's giving a presentation as well. But anyway, all right. So with that, I will just open it up to questions. And we ask that you come up and speak in the mic so that people online can hear.
I'm imagining your decision-making process beforehand, where you can resign, you could not show up, you could show up and try to defend yourself, and you trying to imagine the outcomes of each of those experiences. Could you talk a little bit about that? And then now that you've been through it, I think maybe it didn't turn out as you expected. Would you do it differently? Would you behave differently? It seems that the experience doesn't allow for an honest conversation. And even if there was an honest conversation, it seems that the outcome is essentially predetermined. So,
yeah. Okay, so I'll try to remember all that. I guess I'll answer your last question first. No, I would not do anything different than what I did, other than maybe get more sleep than I did. But even that was difficult. Those were difficult choices I was making at the time, because I wanted to be somewhat prepared, and I wanted to have certain thoughts and things written out beforehand. So I only had a week, so it was difficult to fit everything I wanted to do in a week without something being sacrificed. And for me, that was my sleep time and just time in general. For me, the thought of resigning was never an option. I never considered that. I felt very strongly that I have just as much of a right to be a Latter-day Saint and a member of my community as anybody else. I knew I had positions that weren't necessarily comfortable, and even in opposition to church leaders. I was like, so what? This is supposedly a bigger space that we're claiming to be, and it should make room for whomever. So, and I know a lot of people feel differently about that. I know a lot of people think, well, if it's a, wounded or harmful organization, why would you want to be a part of it? And a lot of people choose to withdraw because of that. For me, it was always important to be part of trying to be a fixer or a challenger of the wounding parts of my community without necessarily abandoning the whole thing as a whole. And I didn't really know. I think we all Mormon in different ways, but for me, it was kind of it was also a family entity in some ways. I'd grown up as a military brat and not with hardly any extended family at all, so the Mormon family was my family. So I don't know how you leave your family necessarily. So for me, it had those sentiments. But at the bottom line, I just didn't feel like, the white Orthodox conservative men have any more right to be there than I do. So why should I have to resign? As far as my options then that I did consider was, do I go public about this or not? That was very difficult for me to know what to do. And for a while, I really thought very carefully about just not saying anything to anybody about it. I figured they probably would excommunicate it. I figured it probably was already predetermined. I was, 2% hopeful it wasn't. But then I tried to just picture what my life would look like, and I was planning to continue the same things that I've always done. So I was continuing to blog and to podcast and to make statements and write letters and all the things that I've done for a decade, more than a decade. And as I thought about doing that in a way where I was privately excommunicated, I thought two things. One, it would make me feel duplicitous. And two, I didn't really trust that the system would hold that confidential anyway. So, it could be, and not even in a bad way per se. I could just see somebody from my Bel Air ward say, why is she still calling herself the Mormon therapist? Doesn't everybody know she was excommunicated last month? Because our ward knows that happened. I mean, I don't think this would have been super secret, at least in the local, and we're not a very big family. And so I just figured people would figure out that I'd been excommunicated anyway. And then, maybe people would feel betrayed that I hadn't been forthcoming about that. So I didn't really see that path as viable with just how I am public. I am a public speaker. I consider myself Mormon. I speak in Mormon ways. And then I felt like people would think, well, maybe she's just trying to lead us, to information without really being transparent. And that's not really in line with my values. So then I decided to be public, and I tried to be fairly I just wanted to be as matter of fact as I could be. That was really my whole approach. This is what's happening. This is what they said I could do. They said I could request letters. That's what I'm requesting. And I know I was emotional throughout the whole process, but I tried to have it just be a very matter-of-fact process. And I also thought early on, this is their game, and I'll play it. That's my choice. And so I was willing to play the game in the sense of following their guidelines and their directives and everything that they required of me, and I did. I did do that. I don't think that's always the best choice for everybody. It is an abusive process, and I don't think that it's always in everybody's best interest to consent to abusive processes. So I willingly consented to an abusive process in a very intentional and mindful way, and I knew I was doing that. I hope I answered all of the things. Okay. Yes, if you want to come up.
Well, there's just some questions on the app. I didn't know if you wanted to.
I think that's Alice's job, the moderator, but yeah.
I'll ask some of those while
Okay.
we're waiting.
Yeah.
That's all right.
No, thank you. We want to include the online people.
So Scott Online asks, how does your experience with the machinations of church discipline affect your perspectives on the sensitivity of the LDS Church to bottom-up pressures for change?
I think that maybe except for the first few months, and I'm not a historian, so I'll just say this one comment, but I think other than the very first few months of our history, I think change has always been bottom up. So I think this is just one more chapter in the Mormon story of people not fitting in a certain box, and then the machine slowly shifts and changes to usually make more people fit. That's usually the direction we go in. But It's a little slower than I think some of us would hope for, and there's some unnecessary tragedy along the way.
Another one.
Okay.
So Heather asks, do you think the adage, all publicity is good publicity, has it been true in your instance, or has your business been, if so, hopefully temporarily, hurt by the media and church impact?
Please speak louder next time.
Do you want me to repeat that one?
Sorry about that. Do you think the adage, all publicity is good publicity, has been true in your instance, or has your business been, if so, hopefully temporarily, hurt by the media and church impact?
So that's a hard thing to measure. Those are things I try not to think about too much throughout my career. They are always things that weigh in the back of my mind. I mean, when I first published kind of the first piece that I knew was in opposition to church leaders, which was my piece on masturbation not being necessarily considered a sin, I was worried about my practice. And it did take a dive after that. I would say I lost probably 30% of my clientele after that post. And I lost the ability to be on the list of LDS Family Services approved, therapists. And not with any knowledge. Nobody called me. Nobody talked to me. They just stopped returning my calls. And so even then, and no bishops or stake presidents talked to me at that point either, but I just heard through my clients, like, they're no longer willing to pay for my services or things like that. So it was just kind of like this background kind of way of communicating with me. I think the whole process hurt my clients in my clinic. I mean, I canceled 2 weeks of my practice pretty much like right away. So people who were in need of seeing me or who were coming to see me all of a sudden had to scramble or see somebody else, and several of my symmetry providers stepped in and took some of those clients on. But that's an interruption in a therapy practice. I mean, most of us who practice therapy, we plan our vacations well in advance. We communicate with our clients well in advance. A lot of our clients are dealing with some very serious issues, and for me to just disappear for 2 weeks and not be very either emotionally or clinically available was definitely harmful for my business. And I definitely noticed a lull probably for about 2 months. Even now, I went from having like a 2 to 3 month waiting list to I'm probably about 3 weeks out right now. So I don't know what that's about, because it also coincided with some other things. It coincided with summer, which tends to be, a slow time for therapy. Who wants to do therapy in the summer? And also it coincided with COVID easing up, so people having more kind of freedom to do other things and go on vacations for the first time in a long time. So it's hard for me to completely measure that. But maybe that's where it's my little Mormon girl that just says I put my faith in the universe and things will just work out, hopefully. But I do want to say, as a single mom who was going through a divorce with an unemployed ex-husband due to COVID, it was your donations that helped me make it through that month and a half. I probably would have had to go into debt if it wouldn't have been for those donations. So I just want to thank you all who gave me food and money and spa treatments and flowers to beautify my home. And there was just so much outpouring, and I don't even know if I've thanked everybody, which weighs heavy. That's how many things came in that I don't even know if I thanked everybody yet. So thank you for that. Thanks, Coach.
So I have a few questions. One, these two are related. The first one, what made you want to stay instead of going through this abusive process? And then the other two that are related are, do you feel, I'm personally against excommunication, but I'm curious what your thoughts are. Do you feel there's ever a place for excommunication? And do you, and with that, do you feel like, if you don't feel like there's a place, do you feel like there's a place for disfellowshipment? Do you feel like there's any place for any of these processes or maybe adaptations to these processes?
Thank you. So I'll start with the second one first again, the ones that are easier, I guess. So no, I do not believe that there's any place for discipline when it comes to people's relationship with their church, their theology, their spirituality, their God. I would even say that for criminals and people who really struggle with all kinds of things that are very difficult for us to grapple with, in our human family. I do think that there are ways churches can be trauma-informed and safeguard their congregations from predators or difficult people without necessarily going to those extremes. I do think it's a spiritually abusive practice, and I think it's something that most other churches have kind of gotten away from over the years because we are more trauma-informed as a people. And I've been inviting my church leaders to be more trauma-informed for over a decade, which is part of why I'm in opposition to them. And will continue to be in opposition to them until that changes. As far as why I'd want to stay, that's a harder one to answer. I think I even have sometimes a hard time conceptualizing all of that in a way that I can verbalize. Kind of like saying, why do you love somebody, right? Or why are you feeling a certain way about things? It's a complicated thing. But at the end of the day, it's everything I've known. For me, it was a family system. For me, it was, at some level, a system where my spirituality and my growth and my religious journey had taken place, and I still have things that are very dear and close to me. I don't consider myself a literal believer, but I do find a lot of beauty and abstractedness and symbology and energy and whatever you want to call it that courses through me. I remember a BYU professor who I'm guessing was in faith transition at BYU, but now that I think about it, but he had us all read the book Flow. So whatever we want to call that flow, for me, happened in Mormonism. In a lot of ways still does. And I'm okay with that. And I'm okay that it comes from a broken place. Maybe that has to do a little bit with my own family. My family is pretty broken. There were abuses and joys and ugliness and beauty in my own family. And they're still the most dear people to me in my life. And I guess that's how I feel about all of you. Because I'm an adopted kid, right? I'm not even a real Mormon. I don't come from pioneer stock. My parents were converts. And it is interesting because in some ways I'm not Mormon very much. And in other ways, that's all I know because I was 5. So I stayed because I loved you and because you were my home and because I was really excited to serve you. And I felt like we could do better. And I felt like I went out and got myself some skills. And I was like, wow, these are really things that could be helpful here in my own home. And that's been my life's work. And even now, I'm not ready to stop doing that. So we'll see how that goes. But so for me, I understand what this means. At the same time, I feel like it doesn't mean much of anything because I'm still here. Thank you.
ready for a therapeutic question?
Sure.
How do you think about the problem of self-pleasuring with that might somehow be selfish if we're all one and related, as a Christian, whether you're a believer in God, but take the Christian view that we are to love each other and care deeply about each other. Do you think that a society who broadly brought children up to say masturbation is just a very normal part of life, and it's very different than sexual intercourse, and therefore, what are we talking about? They're very different things. Talk to me about marriage and love and sexual intercourse. That's different than masturbation. How do you think that through as a therapist? What are your theories that brought you to conclude what you did, given the complexity? I'm guessing, I'm a social psychologist, not a sexual psychologist. That must have gone through your mind thinking this through as a Christian or a Latter-day Saint.
Sure. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, this is not a personal question, so if you want to send me
Yeah.
an email,
Yeah.
I'll take it later.
No, I think it's good. And I've got Ask a Sex Therapist next, so, meet me in that room. But, well, first of all, these aren't my theories, right? I went and studied theories, and I brought them back. But really, I don't know that I have a lot of brilliancy that I could say is unique. Everything that I speak about, maybe I have, charisma, or maybe I'm a good public speaker, or maybe I have a good way to organize thoughts. But most of the stuff that I talk about, I can point to somebody, a mentor, a sociologist, a psychologist, a theorist. And I'm actually really good at that. I'm really good at finding where authority lies. And guess who taught me to do that? Right? Mormonism did. Because I knew I couldn't rely on my own authority. Nobody would believe me. I'm a woman. I don't have a priesthood. And I knew psychology wasn't really a beloved study of Mormonism. So I knew I needed to know my shiz if I was going to come and tell you all something as, opposite as, maybe masturbation is something that's normative and okay and part of normal human development. I did not do that lightly. It took me about 7 years to develop the courage and the knowledge to just be able to publish a blog like I did. So I think the main issues that deal with it from a therapeutic standpoint are, we know that there's this tension, this constant conflict between self-determination and relationship. And when we're enmeshed or codependent or, too tightly wound, and there's not enough self-determination, relationships and people and families suffer. And we also know that when it's too chaotic or too disengaged or not enough connection, it's too individualized, people and relationships suffer. So it's finding that middle ground. And I always like to say, it's not masturbation's fault that it exists. Masturbation isn't necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, just like missionary position sex in a marriage isn't necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. But it's how it's being used and in what context. And the research shows that, especially for female bodies, the more a female understands herself, her ability to understand her body, understand even her potential for orgasm, typically the better a couple does in their sexual relationship together. So I'm a big fan of by the fruits ye shall know them. And I don't know that I've seen a lot of great fruits coming from some of the rigid, more what I would consider toxic messages we've received around sexuality that are more based on to-dos. If you either do this or you don't do that, you either masturbate or you don't, you either look at pornography or you don't, you either have marital sex or you don't. And you can see the big social experiment where there are lots of people who are having great relationships who are not Mormon, who enjoy sexually erotic materials together as a couple, who masturbate on their own as a couple, and are doing great. And you can see Temple recommend holding pew-sitting couples where I have to walk them through the idea that what's happening in their marriage bed is marital rape. So I'm not a big fan of blaming sexual actions for being bad or good. I'm a better fan of seeing what fruits and what's happening with the sexual actions that we're all behaving in. And that's backed up by research and science. Woohoo! You can't be mad at me. I'm just the messenger. But good question. I also think it's a great way to keep our kids from unsafe sex. It's a great way for them to keep the law of chastities, to know that they have autonomy and that they don't rely on anybody else for sexual pleasure. And I think it's a good thing for males to know that they don't rely on sexual pleasure from a woman, that they're not entitled to that. They can take care of themselves. We can always take care of ourselves. It's always better in relationship, usually, but we can always take care of ourselves first. Sorry, Josh, go ahead.
If you had the points of view that you've had, but you didn't have the big platform, you've got a big megaphone. And so imagine if you were just in private practice by yourself and you weren't communicating broadly, but you still held those same viewpoints. It's likely not going, conjecture, but likely not going to attract that attention and the ire of the church and then leading to an excommunication. So my question is, for all those who have a platform right now, they're on social media, they have a following, and they are fearful of sharing their truth because of that retribution. You've been through that cycle now, and they may look at what you experience as probably the worst case scenario for them. But because you've been through that entire process now, what is your message to those folks who maybe have truth that they want to share, but they're afraid of what might happen?
Can I therapize you for a minute? Can you tell me a little bit? Come back, Josh. Can you tell me a little bit about what your emotion is about?
Owning one's voice and saying the things that might not be popular in that moment is scary, but there's so much beauty in that. And anytime I see someone leading with courage, and it's a beautiful thing for me. And there have been times like my Facebook, I've hinted at my points of view, but I'm still afraid to say, and it's 2.5 years, how much control this has over me. But even for me, there's that fear that I don't want to just say, well, folks, I've left the Mormon church, just because I'm afraid of upsetting somebody.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So it had to do with fear, with your connection to this having to do with fear. Yeah, and it is scary. So I guess, there's 2 thoughts I have about that. Well, probably 5 thoughts. but on the one hand, I want to say that me being able to speak out doesn't mean that everybody should, and that that's everybody's path. I think that and we just had a 3-hour ethics conference with Mormon mental health professionals just about this yesterday morning. Because it's difficult to be an advocate and a therapist. Like, I already knew even before my excommunication that there's tons of people out there that could have probably benefited from seeing somebody like me or me myself, but because I'm public about certain things, they refuse to see me. So that weighs heavy on me, and why as therapists we're supposed to stay a little bit blank slate, At the same time, we're the doctors, we're the physicians of mental health, and when we see epidemics, and when we see toxins, and when we see things that should be addressed, it is kind of our responsibility to speak up in some ways or others. I also just want to name my privilege. I think that for the majority of my career up until these last 2 years, I was not the main provider of my home. I had the support of a husband who was the main provider. So when I lost 30% of my clients, it wasn't a matter of me not being able to feed my kids. I also think that I'm white, and I think I've also spoken up at a time in my career where I'm more more secure. I wasn't saying these things the first 5 years of I was trying to still figure out a lot of this stuff the first 5 years of my career. I'm cisgender, I'm heterosexual. I have a lot of heteronormativity privilege, and I'm half Argentine, and I'm an extrovert, and talking comes easily to me. So that's not the case for many, many people in my profession, right? And so I just want to name that. But I do think that fear is always an interesting emotion to be self-aware about and to help us understand how it's informing our decisions and our spaces and our professional spaces. And I think in mental health, there's already so much secondary trauma that we as professionals deal with, that it's hard to add yet one more to do that's heavy. I think it's already pretty courageous to go into the mental health field. We're not really paid that great, and, especially at the beginnings of our careers, and then and it's a very heavy field, and then on top of it, to know and be a successful advocate is difficult. But 200 professionals signed the letter anonymously, the clinical letter. I don't know how many of you know that there was a formal clinical letter that was drafted by a group of 10 Mormon professionals, and it was top-notch, it could be in a journal article. It was very well researched and very well thought through and very respectful, that they sent to President Daley. And we have over 1,000 signatures on that letter at this point, and signatures keep coming in. But 200 therapists felt like they could not put their name to that letter because of fear of retribution. And I'm guessing they work here in Utah or Idaho or the Book of Mormon Belt somehow. And I hope Amy Heffernan doesn't mind me quoting her, but one thing that she talked about as a panelist yesterday was she had asked her bishop, well, Bishop, I podcast and I do things, so what's keeping me from being like Natasha? And he said, well, you're not as annoying as Natasha. And she was like, so define annoying. How am I going to know when I cross the line into annoyingness? Not to mention, that we know through the research that loud females are considered bitchy and annoying. So there's a gender component to this as well. Thanks.
I want to thank you for doing this publicly so that we can keep a conversation with my 4 adult daughters to develop their sexuality. And also, I've heard of something called Strengthening the Members Committee. Is that real, and was this part of it? Did he come with a certain printout that you said this?
Yeah, I do believe that the Strengthening Committee is real.
Is it?
I'm not in church leadership, but Jana maybe has a few comments to make about that. In fact, I'm going to have you come up and share a few thoughts about that. But when I got the original letter that I had asked President Daley to at least put in writing what he was upset with me about so I could kind of be prepared to respond, he did have a few quotes of mine. And one of them is that I had said somewhere that it was important not to replace one patriarchal prick with another. Because I'm a little feisty, I know, but usually I'm not. And Jana, why don't you talk about how long it took you to find that quote?
I found it. Yeah, I was able to find a couple of the quotes that they were using, and they were both within a very short time period on her Facebook page, one that she didn't have access to, but I did because I was her Facebook friend.
I had been hacked also in this year, another thing that happened.
But one of them, we still don't know where exactly it came from. I mean, it could be anywhere. It could be one of her podcasts. It could be whatever. But I can speak to the fact that the Strengthening Church Members Committee is a real thing. In fact, there's a Wikipedia page on it. Look it up. And the church itself has come out and said, yes, it is a thing. And that's all referenced in the Wikipedia page. There were some articles on it in the early 90s in the Salt Lake Tribune. But it's very much not. I think unless you have either been in this position or been a church leader who had a public figure who was annoying and problematic in your jurisdiction, you may not be aware of it. I know I've spoken to my church leaders about it, and they knew nothing about it. So it's not well known, but it's very well known in certain circles.
Yeah, and so it took Jana a long time to find that quote. And I have used the term patriarchal pricks. I'm willing to own it. But for me, it was more like Molly Mormon and Peter Priesthood. It was kind of like, don't be unrighteous dominion, or I'm going to call you a patriarchal prick, right?
Absolutely. And I will also say it was very unclear as to who she was referring when she used it was not even in a church context. It could, and if you look at her Facebook page, I did a lot of analysis. I went through a full year of her Facebook posts, and I made data out of it to see what she was saying, because so much of what they were concerned with her was her public presence. And I would just say that there are so many things that could have been in reference to. Good likelihood it had something to do with the church, but they took it to be like church leaders. It was very clear that that's how they were interpreting it in many, many ways that it could have been taken.
Well, and I've used that term to refer to President Trump. I've used that term to refer to post-Mormon people. I've used that term to refer to church leaders, but usually in general. I've never named a person and said, you are this. But yeah, and I do feel like that was, for me, given the amount of content that is out there of mine and the amount of podcasts and webinars and trainings and writings, I felt like that was a very intentional way to try to mischaracterize me and malign me, because I have maybe used that term 0.0005% of the time that I have spoken in the last 10 years. So I do use colorful language sometimes, and I blame my Latin Italian roots on that. But yes, I felt like that was really mean to paint me out to be some type of cussing, rude, crude person that calls them bad names all the time. So much of my stuff is public. I think you can see my tone usually. And I don't just call out the church, like Jana said. She calls out politicians, she calls out mental health people, she calls out all kinds of people. So I guess that's just kind of what I do.
Absolutely. She was nicer to the church than most of the institutions and people she has issues with on her Facebook page. I mean, truly, she had 11 posts in a year out of hundreds and hundreds of posts. 11 of them had to do with the church, and most of them were had both positive and negative to say, just calling something out, but also saying something positive. And then another handful of them were purely positive, and I could only find one in a year that was just a criticism.
It's nice to have a data analyzer on your team. Now I know how the church feels. They have many. Okay, any other questions?
We have a couple more. Let's see. Matt asks, I fundamentally think this council broke so many of the rules within the handbook. It should have invalidated the council due to these issues. Did the church leadership provide any substantive feedback as to why they supported the local leadership? Do you think the area or senior church leadership wanted this?
Say that last part again, I'm sorry.
do you think the area or senior church leadership wanted this?
Okay. So for me, this is a big guessing game. I really don't know. I've been asked this question a lot, like how far up did it go? Was it my stake president who had a beef with me? Was it something that he was being told to do? I have no idea. I asked many questions throughout this process, most of which I publicly put into letters. I received really no answers ever. Just all of my questions were systematically ignored. I did ask for the entire High Council to be present at my council, which was part of what the manual said that I could do. I asked for the Relief Society to be present. I asked for the names of the people who would be present so I could know if I knew some of these people or not going in there. I was given none of that information. When we arrived, a Relief Society president was there, so she was, it was obvious. Well, actually, no, I take that back. He did tell me, President Daley did say that he was not going to invite the High Council, but that he would invite the Relief Society president. So I did know that going in. But he never gave me any of the names of who would be there, who we talked to. I still don't know the gentlemen that we interacted with names. So this is just where I'm like, I'm kind of in the same boat as all of you. These are questions I would love answers to. I do think that there were several ways that they went against their own church handbook, which was a bit shocking to me because in general, I think at least we do that well usually. We usually go by these kind of rigid rules well, but even the fact that I was being tried in Kansas was very weird to me because in the handbook, it does say that if disciplinary proceedings have started in a particular ward and the person moves while those proceedings are in place, then they will probably finish in the ward where they started. But I had already moved before I was even contacted by them for the very first time. So that was not in place. I did reach out to my local leaders. I wrote a letter to my local bishop and stake president. I wrote a letter to my Kansas area authority, who I knew personally. I wrote a letter to my Utah area authority, which I did not know personally. And I never heard back from any area authority. The only person I heard back from was my Utah stake president, who said that he had conversed with the Kansas stake president and he was supporting his decision to move forward in Kansas. That was it. No reasons, no explanations, and always with lots of warm regards. Everybody gave me lots of warm regards, including my appeal denial, which was extremely painful for them to include that in that statement. Yeah.
So I think one of the reasons ostensibly is to kind of silence you or reduce your influence, at least in certain parts of the of Mormondom. Do you feel like that's happened at all? Do you feel like, what have been the results just in terms of people paying attention, listening to this?
Yeah, that's another thing that's hard to measure, but I agree that that's absolutely the intention. And that was another thing that was brought up by all of the therapists yesterday in the ethics meetings, is that when they silence a mental health professional or discipline one, then that gives a message, at least to more orthodox and believing members, that going to a sex therapist, for example, or going to a therapist who's going to talk about self-determination in ways that don't maybe completely align with your beliefs is dangerous and shouldn't be doing, you shouldn't be doing that, which makes them more vulnerable to seeing what I have been criticizing for a long time as unethical therapists who work really like the church is their licensing board instead of regulatory procedures of having a license as a professional in this state and country. So, and I see that a lot in LDS Family Services. Not everyone. I've actually done a lot of consultations with LDS family therapists over the years about helping them survive working at LDS Family Services. So there's some really good people in LDS Family Services, but they're struggling with the types of overhead that is inappropriate for a church to be placing on a profession that is licensed and regulated by the government. So this has a lot of implications in a lot of different ways. What was really beautiful and humbling for me in this whole process, and I didn't expect it, and I don't say this to like stroke my ego, but I was shocked at how much equal support I had from post members and still active believing members, that as far as the letters that came through, it was just shocking to me. Like, I am the bishop of this ward. Here's my membership number. Here's my stake and address, and this is what I have to say. And you helped my mixed faith marriage, and I can better help the people in my congregation because of things that I learned through Natasha or somebody at Symmetry, or, because I don't even think this is really about Natasha. This is about everybody. This is about Jenny. This is about Jana. This is about Jen, about people who do the type of work that I do. And who take very similar stances as I do, because we're trained correctly and we're willing to go forth with our correct training that makes the church uncomfortable. So that was really helpful for me to think, well, maybe people are more able to be critical thinkers and not always agree with the church in regards to things that are happening, and can make decisions that are well informed for their families and for themselves. But I do believe there is an aspect of our society, in our community, that will absolutely see this as a way to not get the help that they need. And that's devastating for me when it's the parents of a young LGBTQ plus child who runs the high risk of being suicidal. I think we're playing with very dangerous fire. And of course, that's at the heart of most of the criticism that I give the church, is when I see what they say causing bleeding that then we have to wound up when it shouldn't be causing the bleeding to begin with. Thank you.
I hope I can clarify my question as I'm speaking it. I think inspired by Janet and Sarah's presentation yesterday, I was reading Mary Oliver this morning, and one of the poems had an allusion to resurrection. And it made me realize, so I left the church 3 years ago and resigned a couple of years ago, but a day doesn't go by that I don't feel that grief pretty profoundly still. And watching you experience this, like I mentioned to you, like stirred up things that I either thought or hoped or had dissociated enough to believe had settled, but they were not settled. And so so my mind kind of went to this, like I realized I have this yearning to believe in either rebirth or resurrection, not as a literal thing, but as like that those ideas exist in so many myths and stories and poems, because maybe there's something real inside of us that mirrors those ideas. And I wondered if you might be willing to speak to that process in your life right now. Is the rebirth, is a rebirth model more interesting, where you're sort of taking on entirely new forms that you're going to inhabit, or is like a Mormon resurrection model, like I'm keeping this form in some way, but it's going to be reinvigorated, like internally, if you could speak to that part of the journey, or is it that right now it's so much grief that you're not feeling that?
No, thank you. That's a big question. I've journaled a lot about that question. I even wrote poetry around that question. I even had experiences I won't talk about that are maybe a little psychedelic that address that question. So but I think that for me personally, this has been a time where a lot of things have been dying in my life. And it's been a very matriarchal moment for me, because it made me really kind of sit with my own. It's easy to sit with other people and see where their blind spots are, right? It's easy to give really good wisdom and ask really good questions of people sitting in front of me. It's always like 500 times harder to do that with yourself, and why all good therapists see other therapists. But I think, for me, a concept that really came to mind is that, and I get this term from Margie, who I'm sure got it from somebody else, Margie Delenn, but I've been hustling for my worth for a really long time in Mormonism. I had a relationship with my father that was very complicated, and I definitely hustled for his worth. And he died 3 years ago, which I always wondered what that would be like to not have him as a permanent part of my life. I hustled for my husband's worth, and he left me 2 years ago. And I've hustled for the Mormons' church's worth, and they're now kicking me out. So every male entity in my life has profoundly rejected me and hurt me in some very difficult ways. And I don't totally fault that girl that wanted to be loved. And I've always felt weirdly comfortable with male energy. I love men. I fuck men. I'm raising men. So life has offered me a very significant pause to look at my relationship with masculine energy in my life. And so I think that there's something incredibly terrifying about going forth by myself. I've never been offered that role model of being a woman going off by myself. But there's also something very invigorating and liberating and beautiful about it. And that's where I sit, kind of in my spirituality and in my Mormonism. And it's now, it has been a matriarchal Mormonism for me and for a long time. But to me now, it's like all the cords were cut. I was desperately trying to hold on. They let me go, and I have to make peace with the anger and sadness and betrayal of that, while at the same time understanding that it opens me up for new adventure, new possibility I probably would have never imagined for myself, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you for that personal question.
So we have like 2 minutes left. There's a couple of questions that I wanted to read real quick. One of them, do you ever see a future where you decide to pursue rebaptism? And then the other one, the 1993 excommunications, Kate Kelly and Denver Snuffer, all seem to be less about disciplining individuals and more about sending a message that if you belong to a certain group, your membership is in jeopardy. To what extent does this past dynamic apply here? Has it been changed by the internet and past backlash?
What was the first one again? Oh, no. No. I'm a big fan of ritual. I'm a big fan of ceremony. I think that it's very beautiful and can have a lot of meaning. But yeah, if they think that they had any power at any point of separating me from anything sacred in my life ever, they were, largely mistaken. And I don't need to go through some ritual to prove to them, again, that I'm somehow reconnecting. I'm a prayerful person in my own ways, and that doesn't necessarily mean that I sit around praying in the ways that we've talked about, praying correctly. I'm a scriptorian, and again, not just with the standard works. And I find spirituality in my life very impactful and meaningful. So to me, I don't need a baptism into any church, especially by any male authority, to give me anything back. I don't feel like they really took anything away from me. As far as yes, I do think that there are, the group per se that I'm concerned about right now and is psychology and sexual health, sex therapists. We now have a dozen or so sex therapists, maybe getting close to 20 sex therapists in the Mormon population that I'm aware of, and several more in training to become so. And that's greatly needed, and costs a lot of money to get that training, and a lot of extra time and energy. So yes, I am afraid that they're giving the message that those kinds of mental health professionals are not safe. And we've had a conflictual relationship with psychiatry and psychology from the get-go, from the 1950s on. So I am worried about that. And I know that we're out of time, so I'm going to finish with kind of my last thought that I thought I would share with you. I will always be a Mormon, and I was never really a Mormon. I still find great value in spirituality in my Mormon theology, and I find great harm and destruction within some of the ways we currently do mainstream Mormonism. Given all of that, I have done a whole hell of a lot of work to ethically sit with any of you in my office, regardless of how you Mormon or refuse to Mormon. And that's what I hope you will still allow me to do, to serve within this community as a mental health professional and as a sex therapist. That you will not allow the church organization to dictate for you who is safe or helpful for you or not. That you will rely on your own intuition, your own lived experience, and your own capacity for critical thinking and self-education, which I hope is science and evidence-based, to help you find the professional help you and your family need to help you in your individual and relational, mental, physical, spiritual, and sexual health. And I say that with all my love. Amen.